The now former mayor of a southern Mexican city where 43 students were kidnapped in September and presumably killed is facing murder charges in connection with the students' disappearance. My guest, Ev Mead, director of the USD Transborder Institute, joins us with insight into the situation and its political fallout. Ev, welcome to Evening Edition.
Thanks, Peggy.
Now, more than 22,000 people have gone missing in Mexico since about 2006, according to the government there. How is this student abduction different, or is it?
Well, I hope that it serves as a gateway for us to look at these other cases, because if we add the homicides, we were talking 60, some estimates as high as 120,000 people. It's different because it was a lot of students, but it's also different because of the response of civil society, because people have mobilized around it, paid attention, and demanded justice in a way that we haven't really seen so far.
Now, these protests, I understand, are escalating with some violence, some burning of the city buildings in the city where the abduction took place. But there seems to be a disconnect. Why would drug lords or a drug cartel go after students at a poor teaching college?
Yeah, well, I think both of those points are really important. So the first is I would really hesitate to say that the protests are violent. I mean, there's been some property damage, but when we're talking about an armed conflict that's claimed thousands of lives and where people have been savagely tortured and murdered and put on the internet and beheaded and all this kind of stuff, burning some cars and building. I mean, it doesn't quite raise to the level of violence for me. As far as the second part of the question, in terms of talking about what's going on in Guerrero, why these kids would be targeted, it's a great question, and I think it's an indicator that the nature of the violence in the drug war has changed. It used to be that most of the violence was contract enforcement. It was kind of like gangsters during Prohibition in the United States. Now what we see are organized criminals who are actually conquering local municipalities and using the apparatus of the local government, local police, local officials, in order to enrich themselves, to extract resources.
And this is something that, can you relate it back to what happened with these students and the allegations with the mayor of that city?
Sure. So if we look at what these kids are doing, first of all, they came to the city on their way to Mexico City for a national protest, and they were protesting an education reform. It was a national policy. It didn't even have much to do with local politics. They also made some complaints about the local mayor and the local government being corrupt, but it was essentially a basic civil and political protest. And we have to ask ourselves, then why would a drug cartel care very much about this? Well, they cared about this because they were working at the behest of these local officials who want to control the place with an iron fist. In other words, the rationale here was political, not so much about protecting the drug trade or any kind of illicit business.
Is there a history of this in Guerrero?
Absolutely. Guerrero has a long history of government corruption. There are associated massacres of protesters and dissident movements going all the way back to 1962. The governor of the state, Ángel Aguirre, who just basically resigned in shame or out of shame, was forced out of office. He was involved in two separate massacres in the 1990s. Guerrero has a sort of clannish politics. It's local families and landowners some of whom were involved in the drug trade, others just involved in a garden variety corrupt politics going all the way back to the middle of the 20th century.
Now, Mexico's president just got back from a free trade mission in China. During his first 2 years in office, there's been a slight decline in I think some of the violence going on related to the drug lords. But he's focused a lot on Mexico's economy.
Yeah.
Do you think this current outrage and this uprising, so to speak, will have an impact on him? Do you think that he will address crime and corruption?
I really hope so, and because I think that even people who probably didn't vote for him and didn't support him, they hoped that he was sort of right. Even people who didn't like him. The idea that the homicide rate was going down a little bit, that we were talking more about jobs and the economy in Mexico, that even some of the people who disagreed with particular reforms, like the reform of the oil sector, they hoped secretly that he might be right, that there might be a new future. But then when we see this sort of savage attack on these students and his tone-deaf response, takes a trip to China that's basically a publicity tour, doesn't offer much in the way of a federal response, and people are very suspicious of the response that did come, of maybe a forced confession, maybe some lies. So So basically people see here is a lot of artifice. They see a president who's trying to make this go away, but people don't just want this to go away. They want him now to address the substance. And I think people are kind of all in now. They feel like this isn't violence that's just about the drug trade. This is violence that could touch anybody.
Anybody across because it is throughout Mexico, as you have said. Any idea on how long these protests might last? And do you think it will lead to something like this, spring uprising?
It really depends. The closest analog we have in Mexico would probably be the violent suppression of student protesters in 1968. And I think the similarity is the demands that the protesters were making were very small. They were kind of about student issues, student relations with the police. But then it was police repression that turned that into a catalyst for a larger social movement. That could happen here. But I still think we're pretty much early days. I still think people are waiting to see what's going to happen. There's certainly some of the elements of something larger here. I mean, we see the presence of social media. We see students and young people who have a much greater set of expectations for basic democracy than they would have probably a generation before. And we see real, honest-to-goodness frustration and also sympathy with these students from people who are from very different social sectors.
All right, Evmead, thank you for this update. And I know you'll keep us posted on this. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much for having me, Peggy.